Hope you'll keep your Bibles open right there to Acts the 13th chapter. That's where we're going to be setting off, if you will, setting sail even to follow the story of this lesson from Acts the 13th chapter tonight. We have been for the last several months studying from the book of Acts, and I'll tell you why we're doing this. We're doing this primarily because our young people are studying the book of Acts in Lads to Leaders Bible Bowl, and so they've been studying about that, and they're preparing to exercise the skills that they've used next week over in Atlanta at the convention. But the second reason we're studying the book of Acts is because it's one of the great books in the Bible. It's one of the fantastic studies of the New Testament. It's, as we've suggested, it's our identity as members of the Lord's church. It shows us who we are and how we are to behave. And so it's just a fantastic place for us to study together. We've been doing that for the last several months, as I said, and now we've come to a key role, or a place, I should say, in the book of Acts, and that is Acts the 13th chapter. And in Acts the 13th chapter, we really start, if you will, part 2 of the book of Acts. And I know some of you are already thinking, okay, we've been studying this for several months, and you're saying this is part 2, so what does that mean? Does that mean we're going to go for several more months with this series? Probably not as long in the future as we've gone in the past with part 2, simply because the storyline picks up some steam, if you will, and I'll explain more about that as we go into tonight's lesson. But there might not be quite as many text that we want to see and stories that we want to observe as we go into the second part of the book of Acts. But there are still a lot of things that we want to bring to your attention as we continue to study there. The young people, ironically, the ones who are in the puppets, they're actually helping tonight in the wee folks, so that's one reason we're missing a lot of people over on this section tonight. And they're preparing, of course, for lads next week as well. And so we're glad that they can be helping out with the wee folks class tonight that is meeting right now. Well, here we are, part 2 of the book of Acts, as I said. And the reason we call this part 2, part 1 really, if you ask for an outline of the book of Acts, someone might say that a good breaking point would be chapter 12. Basically, in chapters 1 through 12, you read about some of the acts of some of the original 12 apostles. Primarily, you study about Peter, but I know that there are other characters involved. But primarily, the first half or so of the book of Acts, up through chapter 12 or so, is about some of the acts of some of the apostles, which someone says that's a better name for the book itself, not the Acts of the Apostles, but some of the acts of some of the apostles. We don't read about everything they ever did. We don't read about a lot of a majority of the apostles, what they ever did. But primarily in the first half, we read about Peter and some of the things he did. And now, as we come to chapter 13, the apostle Paul, that we've already been introduced to earlier as Saul of Tarsus, who is converted to the Lord, he now becomes the key player, if you will, as we go into the second part of the book of Acts, beginning here in Acts the 13th chapter. Really, the latter part of this book is all about 4 things. It's about Paul and his traveling companions, 3 missionary journeys, and then that trip to Rome, which will be the 4th thing. So that's really what the rest of this book is all about. The missionary journeys of Paul and his voyage to Rome and the things that are associated with it. Some great stories that come along with it, and those are some of the things that we'll be observing. But right here in Acts 13, we read about the beginning of the first missionary journey. Paul and Barnabas set out on a journey that begins with the church in Antioch of Syria. And that takes them out to the coast, and from there they go over to the island of Cyprus, which incidentally was the home of Barnabas and another person we're going to be considering tonight. From Cyprus, they go up to the mainland again, to Pamphylia, Perga of Pamphylia. Then they go to Antioch of Pisidia. They eventually go over to Iconium and down to Lystra and Derbe. And then they basically do a U-turn and they backtrack and they go back through some of the same places that they had already been until they end up back down towards the coast at a place called Italia. And it's from there that they set sail back across the North Mediterranean, and they eventually end back at the sending church, back at the church at Antioch there in Syria. It's been estimated that this first missionary journey took somewhere around 3 years. It's been estimated that it was around 46 to 49 AD, and they traveled around 1,400 miles. A lot of that was by boat, a lot of that was on foot, but it was through some very rugged terrain at times, and this would have been an incredible journey to be on. Now, the thing that I want to bring to your attention tonight in our lesson is a key event that takes place in Acts the 13th chapter. It's an event that at the time must have been a very frustrating thing, particularly to the Apostle Paul. Here in Acts 13 and verse 5, we are introduced to a young man by the name of Mark. He's actually John Mark. He's called John here, and it says that Paul and Barnabas had John as their assistant. Now, we don't know everything we'd like to know about John, and as he's sometimes called, John Mark, and exactly how he is connected to Barnabas. But there is definitely a connection. It seems that there is some kind of kinship involved. Now, the reason we're a little confused about the relationship between Barnabas and Mark probably comes from some uncertainty about the way Colossians chapter 4 and verse 10 is translated. In Colossians chapter 4 and verse 10, the New King James calls John Mark the cousin of Barnabas. But in the King James Version, and I know some people believe if the King James was good enough for the Apostle Paul, then it'll be good enough for us today. A lot of people believe that there's a lot of clarity there in the King James Version. But interestingly, though, in the King James Version, he is called the sister son to Barnabas, which would make him Barnabas' nephew. Well, for what it's worth, most people really believe that Barnabas and Mary, the mother of John Mark, were brother and sisters. You remember the story in Acts the 12th chapter. We studied this last Sunday night. When Peter's in prison, Herod had already killed James. Peter's in prison, and the church has an all-night prayer vigil. It seems it goes on for a number of days. And the angel goes in and releases Peter from prison. And you remember where he goes back to? He goes back to a house where Mary was at, where Mary lived. And it's believed that this Mary is the one that Colossians 4 and verse 10 in the King James refers to as Barnabas' sister. So that would make Barnabas and John Mark related for sure. We know that. And more than likely, Barnabas is his uncle. John Mark is Barnabas' nephew. Well, we're introduced to the fact that he is traveling with Paul and Barnabas on this first missionary journey. But the reason we note that in verse 5 is what happens in verse 13. All we know, according to verse 13, is that when they come to Perga in Pamphylia, after they'd been to Cyprus, the home of Barnabas, which would have been the home of Mary, which would have been the native area for John Mark, after they leave that area and sail up to Pamphylia, Perga of Pamphylia, all we know is that Luke simply writes in verse 13, and John, departing from them, returned to Jerusalem. John Mark's been called one of the most interesting characters in the New Testament. I really think it is an interesting study of John Mark. Mark was one of the few non-apostle writers of inspired books in the New Testament, with a tip of the hat to someone like Luke and James and Jude and whoever wrote Hebrews. Many believe it might not have been an apostle that wrote the book of Hebrews. With the exception of those handful of people, everybody else that wrote in the New Testament wasn't an apostle. Mark, though, is one of those ones who wrote an inspired letter. It's one of the accounts of the life of Jesus. He is the author of the Gospel of Mark. Yet here in Acts the 13th chapter, we read about a decision that he made that we know, and we'll see later, upset the Apostle Paul. And yet, tonight I want us to take a look at this decision and look at some of the things associated with it in a lesson that I'm just simply calling Lessons from John Mark. If you wanted to subtitle this lesson, this is a lesson about decision making, because that's exactly what we're going to be studying about tonight with John Mark. We're going to be studying about decision making. You don't have to raise your hand, but have you ever made a bad decision? Obviously, everyone here could have raised their hand on that one. All of us, from time to time, struggle in our decision making. And perhaps tonight we'll say some things that might bring some clarity, bring some light, bring some help to you, some things to think about and remember in the lessons that we can learn from John Mark about decision making. Now, 3 things, very simple things, that we'll talk about here in the next few moments. First thing is the actual choice that he made. As I said a moment ago, at Perga, he decided to return to Jerusalem. That's all that Luke tells us. Now, what might have motivated this young missionary to abandon the first missionary journey? I mean, you think about where he fits in history. Quite an honor for him to be traveling with Paul and Barnabas as their assistant. What was it that motivated him, though, to turn back and go back home when they got to Perga? Well, a lot of things have been suggested. One commentator suggested that he might have been a little concerned that perhaps Paul was having more prominence among the people than his uncle Barnabas, and it kind of hurt his feelings, and it was enough to make him want to go back home. It has been suggested that he may have been afraid of the perils of mission work, especially falling prey to robbers. When Paul and Barnabas get up into Galatia, in southern Galatia, they'll be traveling winding mountain roads, and that was the perfect place for robbers to hide in a place where you wouldn't see them as you were coming up the road, and they would jump out and they would rob you. And perhaps he had already heard some stories about things like that. Some have suggested that perhaps he saw the poor and the diseased, and he was fearful of really getting sick himself. Remember Mary back in Jerusalem. She had this nice place. Nice enough place where, I hesitate to say the whole Jerusalem church could come and pray at her house. I mean, remember how many people were members in Jerusalem at this point. But it was a big enough place where a lot of people could come and pray. They were well enough to do that they had a servant. Remember Rhoda? She's the one that came to the gate when Peter was out there knocking on the gate when he had been released from prison. And so this must have been a well-to-do family. Barnabas, remember, he had money. So this was a family that had some money. And perhaps, just perhaps, John Mark had lived a life of comfort, being sheltered from the harsher realities of the world. And now all of a sudden he's out here on this first missionary journey and he's seeing life as it really is. And all of a sudden that gets to him. Somebody has suggested that perhaps traveling was tougher on him than he realized it would be. He had just gotten off of a long boat ride from Cyprus up to Perga in Pamphylia. And perhaps the traveling didn't set too well with him. One thing that I've really thought about is the fact that he might have been really excited to go with his uncle Barnabas over to Cyprus when they first left. The first leg of the trip was to leave the coast not too far away from Antioch of Syria and get on the boat and go down to Cyprus. But when they got to Cyprus, they encountered some difficulty. And you remember, John Mark was a witness to all of this. When they got to the island of Cyprus, there was a false teacher there who was a sorcerer who opposed Paul and Barnabas. There was a proconsul there by the name of Sergius Paulus, and some believe that perhaps Paul might have, the change of name might have had something to do with him converting Sergius Paulus, incidentally. But they encounter this man who is interested, the proconsul is interested in talking to them and learning about the gospel, but Elymas, the sorcerer, he is trying to be a thorn in the side of the missionaries. And it may just be that John Mark is sitting back and he's witnessing this and he's thinking, this is going to be a lot harder than I thought. I had these grand ideas of doing mission work, and he'd seen hundreds and thousands of people converted there in Jerusalem, remember? And all of a sudden, he was seeing that mission work is difficult. Maybe that had something to do with it. But obviously, one of the more popular theories as to why he turned back is that he got homesick. John Mark got homesick. All the text says that departing from them, he returned to Jerusalem. Well, who was back in Jerusalem? Mommy. Mommy was back in Jerusalem. And some have suggested that he got homesick, that he was a mama's boy. Matter of fact, Herbert Glockler, in his book in telling about Mary, John Mark's mother, says and describes John Mark as being deeply attached to his mother. And he cites this as one reason why he returned back to Jerusalem. You want the biblical answer, though, as to why John Mark turned back? The biblical answer, the most scriptural answer I can give to you is we really don't know. I know I've spent a lot of time telling you about some of the reasons he might have gone back, and I think all of those are legitimate. Could have been a combination of every one of those things. But we really don't know. The Bible just doesn't tell us exactly the reason why he turned back and he went back to Jerusalem. The bottom line is the Bible doesn't tell us, but it does tell us this, that John Mark exercised his privilege to choose. He wasn't being forced to do this. And that's the real application for us tonight. You have been given the privilege of choice in your life. That is the way God created all of us. He made us, as we say, free moral agents. And so we have the privilege of choosing how we're going to live our life. Joshua attested to this when he said, "Choose this day whom you will serve." Remember back in Joshua, the 24th chapter. And so why I say this to you is, don't let anybody ever tell you that you're pre-programmed to behave in a certain way. We hear people today talk about how they can't help being the way that they are. And in some cases, they say that God made them a certain way. They say that God made them this way, they were born this way, and so they can't help but act on the way that God made them. But the contradiction is the Bible is describing the behavior they're doing as sinful. So there's an issue there. And I would suggest to you the truth of the matter is God would never describe something being sinful if He made you to do it. If God, He may have given you the capacity to do it. He may have given you, and this is what we're saying, the choice to do it. But He would have never made you to be sinful from your birth if in fact later He would write the Bible and say what you're doing is a sin. That would be a contradiction to the personality and just the person of God. For Him to make you be a certain way and for that way to be a sinful way. The real truth of the matter is, what I think we can observe and what we can learn is God made us to be able to make choices with our lives. There are certain things that are described in the Bible as sinful. Actions, attitudes, things that we do are described as sinful. And we need to be real careful that we don't just pick out a few of our favorite sins that we like to point out that some people are committing that are saying, I can't help this is the way God made me. It's a very slippery slope if you think about it, some of the arguments that are being made there. What about the pedophile that's going to come up here before long saying, well, this is the way God made me? What about a person who says, well, I've got a disease that causes me to want to drink all the time. This is the way God made me. What about a person who says, I can't help it. I like to steal things. That's the way God made me. Well, before long, every sin will be a convenient sin of that's just the way God made me. You see the problem with this. See, all of these things are choices that people make. People make choices, and that's the way God made us. We thank God for Him giving us this free moral agency. Just remember this, our heredity and environment shape us, but they do not make us. Never let anybody tell you that you are made in such a way that you are deprived of free will, that you are deprived of choice. Your heredity and environment may shape you, it may influence you, but it does not make you. It doesn't make you behave a certain way. Second thing to consider in these lessons from John Mark is the consequences that come right along with the decisions that we make. Mark teaches us that all of our decisions have consequences. Now, I know a lot of our decisions that we make every day seem inconsequential. They don't really seem like they have consequences. But granted, there are decisions we make every day that do have consequences. And of course, when we make decisions that involve serving God and doing right, all of those decisions have consequences, and they will make an impact on others at some point. Another lesson, incidentally, that Mark teaches us here is the subtle lesson that our choices may not reveal an immediate consequence. We may think we choose to do something and, well, look, I think I got away with that one. Don't seem like it really bothered me that much or bothered anybody else that much. But then what we might find out is, days later, weeks later, months, perhaps years later, there will be some consequences to that decision. If you don't believe it, turn real quickly over from chapter 13 to chapter 15. And I'll show you how our decisions have consequences. Here in Acts the 15th chapter, beginning in verse 36, this is after they had returned, Paul and Barnabas had returned from the first missionary journey. This is actually after they were back in Jerusalem for a while. They had what we call in Acts 15 the Jerusalem Conference. And then in verse 36, it says, "Then after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, 'Let us now go back and visit our brethren in every city where we have preached the word of the Lord and see how they are doing.' Now Barnabas," verse 37 says, "was determined to take with them John Mark." John called Mark. But notice what it says, verse 38. "Paul insisted that they should not take with them the one who had departed from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work." The contention became so sharp that they parted from one another. This is Paul and Barnabas. That they parted from one another. And so Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and departed, being commended by the brethren to the grace of God. Notice that Paul saw Mark's departure from them. He saw that in only one way. He saw that as him having not gone with them to the work. That's verse 38. And Paul wasn't going to take that chance again. This decision that John Mark had made to leave them on the first missionary journey was at this point unacceptable to Paul. And because this contention was so sharp, they decided to part ways. Now, I think you can learn something that's quite pleasant here, and that is Christians can learn to disagree without being disagreeable. The two people who had gone on the first missionary journey, who decided they needed to go on another one, but decided they couldn't take the one they agreed on, actually went off in their own separate directions and had two more missionary journeys. It seems that Barnabas and Mark go to Cyprus to follow up, and Paul, now with Silas, goes on what we call Paul's second missionary journey. But Mark's decision had consequences. And here's the practical lesson for us to learn. So do ours. Our decisions have consequences. Did you know that your decision to be a Christian has consequences? Hopefully it has good consequences. Maybe a better way of thinking about it, if you're here tonight and you're not a Christian, is if you've decided not to be a Christian up to this point in your life, your decision has consequences. It's adversely affecting someone, I can guarantee you. They've watched you. They know you. They know that you're not living right. I read the story about a brother and sister. And the sister was a Christian. The brother was not. Later, their dad died. And the sister told her brother at some point, she said, "You know the worst thing about Dad's death was not that he died. It was the fact that he died knowing you weren't a Christian." See, she believed that her dad had been adversely affected and worried over her brother who was not a Christian. Our decisions have consequences. Our decisions as Christians, the way we live, have consequences. When we do not live as salt and as light, we do not live as ambassadors that has a negative impact on those who are watching us live, those that we live with, those that we work with, perhaps those that we go to school with. Our decisions as parents have consequences. We are, with how we're living right now, shaping how our children will one day behave. Even the way we respond to little things, it will shape more than likely the way our children respond to little things. And certainly how we respond to big things will shape how our children respond to big things. If I'm somebody that loses my cool a lot, raises my voice too much, more than likely my children will learn to do that with the people around them. So think about our decisions and the consequences that come with that. I influence my coworkers, I influence my classmates, I influence my friends with the decisions I make. Truly, as Paul said, none of us lives to ourselves and none of us dies to ourselves. Romans 14 and verse 7. The good news about this story is that there's a comeback. There's a comeback, and that's the positive thing that I want us to close with here. You know, many times in life, we only get one opportunity to choose to do the right thing. And when we don't make the right decision, the result of that decision or the consequences of that decision may be out of our control based on our former decision. But then sometimes we're fortunate enough when we make the wrong decision to get an opportunity to make amends. It's God giving us what we might call a mulligan. There's a big golf tournament on right now. And sometimes you need a mulligan in life, a second chance. And, you know, Mark got that. That's what Mark was eventually given. As we've already noted in Acts 15 and verse 39, Mark's uncle, Barnabas, gave him a second chance. Paul wasn't willing to do it, but Barnabas was. And he took him and they went to Cyprus. You know, that may seem like the end of the story here. If you didn't know the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey might say, it might seem like that when Barnabas took John Mark and went to Cyprus, and Paul chose Silas and went on the second missionary journey, being commended by the brethren, that was kind of the end of this story. But I would suggest to you that Paul wasn't done with John Mark just yet. True to the nature of being a New Testament Christian, Paul, in time, decided that he could forgive John Mark. He changed his mind about him. At this point, when the beginning of the second missionary journey was about to take place, Paul said, "No, I don't want him with me. He is not useful to me." But he later had a change of heart. We know this because Philippians 2 and verse 4 calls John Mark Paul's fellow laborer. In Colossians 4 and verse 10, the verse that I mentioned just a moment ago, Paul acknowledges Barnabas and he recommends for the brethren to welcome him. But what he says about him in 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 11 to Timothy is probably the most telling statement. Because there in 2 Timothy 4 and verse 11, Paul writes to Timothy and he says, "Only Luke is with me." Only Luke is with me. And remember, this is toward the end of Paul's life when he writes this. "Only Luke is with me. Get Mark," John Mark, "get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for the ministry." That's the comeback. John Mark had the opportunity to make a comeback. And I'm glad that we see that part of the story. I'm glad God tells us that part of the story. The truth is, God is always willing to give you the opportunity to change course. God's always willing. If you are alive and breathing right now, and you are because you're here, whatever mistakes you've made in the past, whatever bad decisions you've made in the past, right now God gives you the opportunity for the comeback. He gives you the opportunity to make amends. Now, I've got to be honest with you and remind you that while God is willing to forgive you of your sins from the past, there might still be some consequences left over from those decisions that you still might have to deal with. God will forgive you of the sin, but He won't always remove all the consequences. Those things are set in place by our former decisions, if in fact we're dealing with bad consequences from bad former decisions. So God won't take those consequences out of the way. I mean, that's part of life. That's where the rubber meets the road, as we say. He might not be able to clean up our lives physically, so to speak, but He can clean up our lives spiritually. I'm glad that we read about the comeback. And you know, it should be noted, incidentally, that the real issue that a lot of people struggle with is not God giving the second chance. The real issue that a lot of people struggle with might be trusting that other human beings will give a second chance. And we've got the great record here of not only Paul being willing to do that, but we also know that another apostle, the Apostle Peter, was a mentor to Mark. And he gave him a second chance. He, I'm sure, was disappointed when he heard this story originally. But in 1 Peter 5 and verse 13, he called Mark my son. A lot of people struggle with second chances. A lot of people maybe aren't sure if God would give them one. I hope you understand that He will. A lot of people doubt that their brothers and sisters would give them one. But I hope you understand that you're among people who are sinners just like you, who struggle just like you. We've all made our mistakes, and we've all needed a second chance from someone. And so don't think tonight that you can't make the comeback if you need to. You know the person that so many people actually struggle with in the comeback? They struggle with themselves. They start thinking, well, you know, maybe God really can't forgive me. Maybe He's not willing to forgive me. They think maybe my brethren might say tonight, way to go, we appreciate you responding and being restored, but they might doubt me later. But so often it's the self-conflict, the struggle to forgive self that so many people, in fact, will struggle with. I want to remind you tonight that there are great lessons to be learned from John Mark about decision making. I think all of us can see something here that will benefit us tonight. And I would remind you also, as we close, it is fair to say that life, even your life, is really measured by the decisions that you make. Life is a series of decisions. And at this point in your life, I'd ask you, have you made the right decisions? And I know what a lot of you are probably thinking right now. A lot of you are probably thinking, you know, I think I've made more bad decisions than I've made good decisions. And maybe you're thinking, you know, maybe this lesson isn't for me. But the truth of the matter is, all of us have made more bad decisions than good decisions. And it's really not a matter of, you know, making more good than bad or bad than good. That's not really the way it works. Hope you know that. If you've made a lot of bad decisions, you're in the right place, because when you participate in the comeback, you're coming back to the one who has forgiveness for you and understanding for you and love for you. And we want to offer you that tonight. On this Sunday night, there might be someone here who needs to make the comeback. And if that's the case, why don't you respond right now as we stand and as we sing.